There's no new fact about that day we need the Democrats' extraneous commission to uncover.
This vote has made it official. Donald Trump's big lie has now fully enveloped the Republican Party.
Senate Republicans block a bipartisan investigation into the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, solidifying the Republican Party's loyalty to Donald Trump. Hello and welcome to Inside America. I'm Ghida Fakhry. We may never know exactly what led to the deadly attack on the U.S. Congress. That is because Senate Republicans used their filibuster power on Friday to block the establishment of an independent commission to compile a full account of what happened when rioters stormed the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. Despite Republicans agreeing that an investigation was needed in the immediate aftermath of the attack, only 6 Republicans voted in favor of creating the 9/11-style commission. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said ongoing investigations by congressional committees were enough.
I think this is a purely political exercise that adds nothing to the sum total of information.
The final Senate vote of 54 to 35 fell short of the 60 votes needed to overcome the Republican filibuster. Before the vote last Friday, President Joe Biden said he expected bipartisan support for the investigation.
I can't imagine anyone voting against the establishment of a commission on the greatest assault since the Civil War on the Capitol.
The lack of a bipartisan congressional investigation is likely to leave unanswered questions about why so many people have rallied around what has become known as Donald Trump's, quote, big lie, that he, not Biden, won the elections, a claim that Trump himself still maintains. Now, according to a recent poll, a majority of Republicans, 56%, say they still believe that the 2020 election was the result of illegal voting or election rigging. 3 in 10 Republicans, that's 28%, say they believe, quote, because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots have to resort to violence in order to save our country, unquote. Just 7% of Democrats and 13% of independents say the same. Now, without a thorough investigation into what happened on January 6th, will Americans and the Republican Party continue to rally around Donald Trump and his claims regarding the elections? I'm now joined by Galen, co-founder of the Lincoln Project, a political action committee formed in 2019 by current and former members of the Republican Party. In 2020, the group's aim was to prevent the re-election of Donald Trump. Galen, the Lincoln Project tweeted, quote, 35 Senate Republicans voted to cover up the deadly attacks of January 6th after they blocked the establishment of the commission. Why wouldn't Republican lawmakers want to pursue a thorough investigation into the attack on the U.S. Congress? What do they have to lose? What do they have to hide?
Well, what I think they have to lose is a couple of things. One is that they know that they do not want Donald Trump on their bad side because they fear him and they live in fear of him and his supporters. Secondly, they are concerned that spending the next, let's say, 2 to 3 months really digging into what happened on January 6th at the Capitol. And remember, this is just 5 months ago. Will look bad for the Republican Party, as it should. And lastly, they know that this will probably drive away a lot of donors, especially corporate donors, and put a spotlight on what the Republican Party has become, which is one of, white nationalism, resentment, ugliness that is now dominating the party and will for the foreseeable future.
But if this is what it is, if it is a cover-up to protect one individual, if it's a conspiracy, an attack on U.S. democracy, does it also imply potential treasonous behavior? Is that what's at play here?
Well, I'm not sure about treason, but certainly sedition, I think, is on the menu for this. And it's not just a matter of protecting one person. It's a matter of protecting single people, dozens of people perhaps, who were either working on this idea, whether or not it was the rally or the idea to gather these people together and to march on the Capitol, what Republican members of Congress or U.S. senators might have had to do. I can tell you this, the last thing that Mitch McConnell wants is Josh Hawley or Ted Cruz being hauled up before one of these committees, maybe their cell phone records being subpoenaed and finding out just what it is they knew and when they knew it.
So you say it isn't just about protecting Trump. but several of his allies as well in the US Congress. But the midterm elections being just 18 months away, and some Republicans who are opposed to Trump saying the Stop the Steal messaging could be a winner in the 2022 midterms. Is the outcome, in your mind, all but guaranteed? Do you believe that pro-Trump Republicans will be elected to Congress and that Trump himself could be president again in 2024?
Well, I think it's certainly too early to say whether or not pro-Trump Republicans will win their general elections. But I will say this, is that if you are running in a competitive Republican primary, Stop the Steal will have to be one of your key messages, because if you are an anti-Trump Republican, you're not going to win a Republican primary. Now, whether or not those Republicans can take that message into a general election next November, I think remains to be seen. Certainly, a lot of these congressional districts are highly gerrymandered, so there won't be many competitive districts. And in these Senate races, you're going to see that people like Rick Scott from Florida and Mitch McConnell are already begging Donald Trump to stay out of those races, which I don't think he'll do, which means that Republicans could have quite a motley crew of people running for the general election next year.
But so if this pro-Trump messaging does carry weight with a lot of voters, potentially, can there be a credible alternative, a third party for Republicans who will not support Trump if he runs again?
I would say this, in the short term, the answer is no. And the truth is that our system in this country is designed really to keep out competition. We are a two-party country. Republicans and Democrats have dominated this country since 1860, and that is not likely to change. Now, you might see some smaller regional parties, maybe in an individual state, try and get in on this competitively. But the truth is that at the state level, neither Republicans nor Democrats want a lot of new entrants. Now, in places where it's easier for independents to run, maybe you'll see that. But I think for the time being, if you truly care about democracy, if you're an anti-Trump Republican, then the place for you to, unfortunately, if you feel this way, maybe it concerns you, but the place to be is with the Democrats, at least for the foreseeable future.
How concerning are the new trends for you within the Republican Party? Because a poll released just last month showed that 15% of Americans say they believe the QAnon allegation that, quote, the government, the media, and financial worlds in the US are controlled by a group of Satan-worshipping pedophiles who run a global child sex trafficking operation. 23% of Republicans support this claim, significantly more than independents, 14%, and Democrats, 8%. Republicans are notably more likely than independents and Democrats to be QAnon believers. What do you make of that?
I mean, I'll say this is just repeat the description you just gave. The fact that anybody believes that in the United States, I think, is highly concerning. The fact that if you mix that 23% of Republicans who believe in QAnon with, let's say, another 40% of Republicans who believe that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump, you have a political party that is off its rails. It is not moored to any sense of legitimacy, any sense of ideology, or any sense of reality. I think we're in a lot of trouble here. I think that if Republicans win another federal election, whether or not that's 22 or 2024, this country is in a lot of trouble, and I'm not sure that we get it back.
Your group is saying that what we are seeing today is the moral collapse of the Republican Party. Are we really seeing the end of the GOP if there isn't a real alternative?
Look, I mean, we've seen the end of the Republican Party as I knew it, as I grew up in it as a child when my father worked in Republican politics, in the 20-some years that I worked in Republican politics. That party is dead and gone. It is not coming back. It must be defeated at all levels extensively. It must be driven to exhaustion, and it must be driven back into the woods with its ugliness, its ideal of white nationalism, of Anglo-Saxon beliefs, that is all rooted in race and ultimately religion, that now we're seeing former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn calling for an armed insurrection, an armed coup by the military. We have people like J.D. Vance in Ohio who are calling for the destruction of Republicans' enemies. This party is gone. It is not coming back. And my advice to anybody who believes it is that you are either naive or you're complicit.
All right, Reed Galen of the Lincoln Project, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Meanwhile, a handful of Republicans have spoken out against the influence of Donald Trump on the GOP. Representative Liz Cheney lost her position in the Republican leadership last month after publicly rejecting the former president's lie that he won the 2020 election. But defending Trump can be good for politics, especially with midterm elections coming up in 2022. To discuss, I'm joined by Saul Anuzis, the former head of the Michigan Republican Party and senior advisor to United States Senator Ted Cruz during the 2016 presidential campaign. Saul Anuzis, Senator Ted Cruz is one of the Republican senators who are opposed to the creation of a commission to investigate the January 6th attack on the US Congress, which he called at the time a terrorist attack in a very dark moment in the nation's history. You've been tasked with running his campaign effort in Michigan. Why would the GOP, why would senators like Ted Cruz be opposed to this? Has it become a campaign party platform for the 2022 midterms and the 2024 elections?
Well, look, I think that the way the Democrats are structuring the commission, that this is purely political theater. The Senate Republicans have offered amendments to basically make this purely a nonpartisan, bipartisan commission to study what actually happened there. I mean, it was clearly a demonstration that turned into a riot, and there are people who will go to prison and are being arrested for, the different acts that are there. But what the Democrats want to do is politicize it. And so the Republicans tried to get a nonpartisan commission set up in a way that it was not designed to have political benefit, and the Democrats just refused to do so.
But that isn't true, though. That isn't true. This would have been a bipartisan commission. In fact, Democratic and Republican leaderships would have been allowed to choose an equal amount of commissioners, 5 on each side. So how can you say this was just a political theater?
Right,
if an investigation was imminent, why not be part of it?
Well, first of all, the investigation is ongoing. The FBI is using one of the most extensive investigations of any crimes in the history of our country. So there will be a very detailed investigation done by the FBI that is not partisan, that is not set up for political influence. The problem is the way.
But again, why? How can you say that this was partisan if it was going to be divided along bipartisan lines? 5 commissioners on either side.
Because it's not just a function of who serves on the committee, it's the process that is going to take place, the staff that will investigate it, the procedures that are going to be used. The Republicans offered a purely nonpartisan commission to be done outside of the political realm, and the Democrats refused to do so. Therefore, Republicans are opposing it.
Well, now Democrats may go it alone. They may, in fact, set up their own select House committee, which would not be mandated with having an equal number of Democrats and Republicans. Why then take the risk to have the Democrats go it alone instead of being part of this and actually making sure that it is a fair process?
Well, again, number one, if the Democrats go it alone, it will be clearly partisan. So everybody will understand that the Democrats are trying to get political advantage. Number two, just again, having equal number of members does not make it fair, does not make it bipartisan. The process is important. The rules are important. The way the staff who are going to be asking the questions, raising the questions, doing the investigations, all those details are extremely important. Republicans offered a nonpartisan approach. The Democrats refused. So now we have a partisan commission that the Democrats want to run, and we understand that. That's political, but that's the reality of where we are today, and that's why Republicans are opposing it.
Republicans in the Senate and in the House also say they don't want to relitigate the past. Why then are we seeing this constant effort to relitigate the 2020 election results in key battleground states? Isn't that going back into the past?
Not at all. I mean, we're not relitigating the past. If you take a look at, there is no effort right now at all dealing with litigating the old races. There are some recounts going on. There are some analysis that are being done, and it's the right thing to do. I mean,
it's happening. You know that it's happening in 2 battleground states. It's happening in Georgia and in Arizona.
Right, and you realize that the majority of the American people still think that there is something wrong with the elections. So the idea of us making sure that it is clear that these elections were fair and open is a smart thing to do. And that's what they're trying to do around the country.
Well, but it's been 7 months since the election. These efforts to question the legitimacy of the election results continue. So the so-called big lie has become so deeply rooted in the Republican base. In fact, 64% of Republican-leaning voters in a recent poll said they did not believe that Biden won enough votes legitimately to win the presidency. Isn't that a serious problem?
It is a serious problem, and that's why it is important to get to the bottom of it and to make sure that everybody is clear that there were no systematic fraud, that there was no widespread fraud. And the only way you can do that is to do an audit, to do a recount and make sure these elections were held fairly. This is the right process, and that's why they're doing this across the country. There are hundreds of laws that have been introduced to clarify many of the misunderstandings that took place during the election process. And it's all being set up to make sure that people are not confused and that people are comfortable with the way the American process works.
But there is a concerted effort to confuse people, to push the myth that this was all stolen, that Trump won. You know as well as I do that there have been lawsuit upon lawsuit that were just thrown out of court for being baseless. In fact, the Michigan Secretary of State, the Secretary of State in your own state, said this: "It is time for leaders across the political spectrum to tell their constituents the truth, that the elections were the most secure in history and reflect the will of the Michigan voters." She said Michigan state legislatures have introduced 39 bills that restrict voting rights. Isn't that the real issue here?
No, the real issue is that the mainstream media keeps playing the left and the Democrats' perspective. I mean, look, if you listen to everything that's being said out there right now, is people are trying to make it sound as if the Republicans are doing something wrong. All the Republicans are asking for is that real citizens who are registered to vote show a picture ID and prove who they are before they vote. We're trying to make it very easy to vote and hard to commit fraud. That's all that's happening with all these bills. The Georgia controversy was completely blown out of the water once people started reading what was actually in the bill. They made it easier to vote. They made it easier to participate, but they made sure that it couldn't be fraudulent. That's the real issue when it comes to election fraud.
All right, Saul Anuzis, the former chairman of the Republican Party in Michigan, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be with you.
Now, as members of the Republican Party continue to pledge their loyalty to the former president, criminal investigations of Donald Trump and his company, the Trump Organization, are underway in several jurisdictions. Last week, the Manhattan District Attorney, Cyrus Vance, convened a special grand jury that could bring criminal charges against Trump himself or executives at his company. It comes after New York State Attorney General Letitia James announced last month that the civil investigation into the Trump Organization had become a criminal one.
Our civil investigation continues, but we are now actively investigating the Trump Organization in a criminal capacity, and we are working alongside, cooperating with the Manhattan District Attorney, Cy Vance.
Trump denies any wrongdoing and called the seating of the grand jury, quote, a continuation of the greatest witch hunt in American history. Now, it is just one of many legal proceedings centered around the former president. Prosecutors in Atlanta have also launched a criminal inquiry into Trump's efforts to overturn the election in Georgia. So will Trump face criminal charges, and how will his legal troubles affect his grip on the Republican Party and a potential run in 2024? I'm joined by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David K. Johnston. He is author of The Making of Donald Trump, and most recently, It's Even Worse Than You Think: What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. The latest book in his Trump trilogy, The Big Cheat, will be published in September. David K. Johnston, you predicted 9 months ago that the Trump inquiry would turn into a criminal one. It now has. How significant is this?
Oh, very significant for Donald, and particularly if my prediction that it would turn into a racketeering charge. Under New York state law, there's a law similar to the federal RICO law, and it allows the government to freeze and seize his assets upon the filing of an indictment. And it poses a very significant threat to Donald, his children, other people in the Trump Organization itself. And that's what I anticipate. In addition to charges of bank fraud, insurance fraud, business record fraud, which can get you 25 years in New York, I think there's a very high likelihood that we will see a state-level racketeering charge.
And you've spent a long time investigating Trump's business dealings. The fact that the grand jury will now decide whether or not to indict the former president on criminal charges is significant, as you say. But is there enough evidence, do you think, to pursue a prosecution? What is the likelihood that there will be criminal charges brought against him?
Yeah, Donald has been a criminal his entire life. Little known fact, a story I broke 5 years ago. Donald Trump has already been tried twice for income tax fraud. Now, it was civil, not criminal. But in one of those two cases, his own tax lawyer testified that the tax return Donald Trump filed was a forgery. that he put the signature of the tax preparer on it with a photocopy machine. And finding criminal acts by the Trump Organization, it's about as difficult as finding a traffic light in Midtown Manhattan.
But he says, as you know, that there's nothing more corrupt than an investigation desperately looking for a crime. These are his words. And in fact, in a statement that he issued after the grand jury announcement, he said this. He said, "This is purely political and an affront to the almost 75 million voters who supported me in the presidential election, and it's being driven by highly partisan Democrat prosecutors. Our country is broken, our elections are rigged, corrupt, and stolen. Our prosecutors are politicized, and I will just have to keep on fighting like I have been for the last 5 years." Obviously, his strategy of presenting himself as the victim, the underdog, someone who is fighting the establishment, and the fact that he is now able to say, well, look, the two elected officials in New York looking into these potential criminal charges against me are Democrats, could work for him.
Maybe. I don't think it'll work with a jury. The fact is that Donald doesn't have anything else to say. He has been cheating people, stealing from people. He's been found after previous federal court cases to be an unreliable witness who lies on the witness stand. And his record is one of lifelong criminality. But like many white-collar criminals, he's never been charged. I mean, John Gotti, before he finally was convicted, could have said, what do you mean? Nobody's ever accused me of any crime. They're just going after me because I'm a well-known figure. That's all Donald is doing here. He's ignoring the fundamental facts about his behavior and his conduct that I've been writing about for more than 30 years.
And if this doesn't have any impact, obviously, on a jury and in a court of law, what could be the impact politically? Because a new poll out just last month shows that 63% of Republicans think Donald Trump should run for president again in 2024, compared to only 8% of Democrats and 23% of independents. And 53% of Republicans think Donald Trump is the actual president, not Joe Biden. And this is something Trump himself highlighted on his website with the words, "I always knew America was smart." How will this new level of legal risk to him affect his popularity with the Republicans?
Well, Ghida, even among Republicans, we're talking about a small group of people. The Republican Party is a minority party. It's shrinking. This is the reason we've seen close to 500 bills introduced around the country to make it more difficult to vote, because the Republicans have lost popular support. And this is something they've been warned about for a half century. Literally, a half century ago, articles started appearing where political scientists and professionals said the Republican Party has to adapt to the changing demographics or it's going to go away.
But you're still talking about 75 million people almost who voted for him.
Sure. 75 million people voted for Trump. But I don't think you would see that many again voting for him. There's no question that there's a lot of people who really don't like America the way it is. And by and large, they fall into two groups. The group I've written a lot about for years, the 90% of Americans whose incomes today are smaller than they were in the mid-1970s. You have to adjust for inflation. But they're not making as much money as they were 50 years ago. And they're legitimately angry at both political parties. The other, however, and it overlaps with it, is the group that wants to make America white again. People who believe that anyone who isn't a white nominal Christian should know their place and shut up. And that's become eminently clear from Trump's rallies, from his attempted coup on January 6th, and even from some of the defense arguments being made by those who've been charged with the first siege of our capital since the British burned it in 1814.
David K. Johnston, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
In a sign of just how serious his legal challenges are, Trump could well become the first former president in US history to be charged with a crime if the newly convened grand jury decides there is sufficient evidence to indict him. This in addition to the ongoing criminal investigations in New York and Georgia. Now, several previous presidents, including Bill Clinton and Richard Nixon, faced the prospect of criminal charges, but were never indicted despite being investigated by special prosecutors and independent counsels. Court documents unsealed just a few years ago show that a federal grand jury was prepared to indict Nixon on 4 criminal counts before he resigned. Despite the growing signs that Trump could well become the first former president to be charged, many GOP members seeking re-election in the 2022 midterm elections are still trying to leverage their undying support of Trump for their short-term political benefit. And so, in short, Trump will continue to repeat his old mantra that these latest investigations are a continuation of the greatest political witch hunt in the history of the US. He knows that these grievances, however unfounded, will rally support among his disgruntled and defiant base, adding yet more fuel to the Stop the Steal campaign, a slogan that he and his Republican allies will continue to deploy for their strategic electoral gain. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry. Send us your thoughts and comments. For now, from the entire team in Washington, thanks for watching.